Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
Today's going to be intense.
It is. We are cracking open a text from the 16th century, the autobiography of St. Teresa of Avila. And look, the mission for this deep dive is simple, but frankly, terrifying. We aren't just reading the biography of a Spanish nun. We are looking at a field manual for accessing a different layer of reality.
A layer that most of us, especially in the modern world, try very, very hard to ignore.
Exactly. We are exploring the concept of God, not as some, fluffy cloud or a Sunday school idea, but as a visceral, overwhelming, and sometimes violent experience.
Right.
We're talking about the thin line between divine revelation, total madness, and the demonic. It's lively, it's fluid, and it challenges the entire materialist worldview that we usually just take for granted.
It forces a confrontation. You really can't read this text and stay neutral.
So let's set the scene. The book is The Life of St. Teresa of Jesus, written by Teresa herself. And before we get into the levitation and the visions of hell, we have to talk about who she was.
Yeah.
Because she wasn't born a saint, she's actually incredibly funny.
She is. That's the first thing that just disarms you when you read her. She's so self-deprecating.
Right.
She calls herself ignorant. She calls herself wicked. She makes fun of her own vanity. But underneath all that humor is a psychological insight that, rivals Freud or Jung. She is mapping the human mind with a precision that is just startling for the 1500s.
And this is where that God versus atheism angle really kicks in, because we live in a world where the default setting is matter is real, atoms are real, brain chemistry is real.
And everything else is just in your head.
Exactly. Everything else is a hallucination.
Right. The materialist view says that consciousness is just a byproduct of the brain, sort of like exhaust from a car.
And then you have Teresa. She describes very casually hearing voices, seeing the hands of Christ, or being speared by an angel. Now, a skeptic hears that and says, Psychosis. Temporal lobe epilepsy? Take your pick.
And that is the tension we are going to explore today. Because Teresa, she anticipates that skeptic. She doesn't just blindly accept these things. She categorizes them. She tests them.
She's constantly asking herself the question.
Constantly. Is this God? Is this the devil, or is this just me being hysterical? She applies this rigorous, almost scientific method of discernment to her own soul.
She's a phenomenologist of the divine.
That's the perfect way to put it. And she argues, through her life and her writing, that this spiritual layer is actually more real, more solid than the chair you're sitting in right now.
So let's rewind to the beginning. Segment 1, The Reluctant Saint. Because she starts out as a bit of a drama queen, doesn't she?
Oh, she was very much a drama queen. Sure. But Teresa is an efficiency expert. She looks at the options. You can be a monk or a nun, pray for 50 years, maybe get to heaven. Or
you can get martyred.
Right. Get your head cut off by the Moors and boom, instant pass. Straight to the top.
It's so transactional.
Completely. It wasn't about loving God. It was about buying the best ticket for the cheapest price. So she and her brother, they pack a lunch, literally just a snack, and they run away from home, heading toward North Africa, hoping to find someone to behead them.
Fortunately for Spanish literature, their uncle found them just outside the city walls.
Right. But it shows her personality. She wanted the greatest thing, and she wanted it now. She didn't do things by halves.
But then puberty hits.
And the girl who wanted to be a martyr discovers boys. She discovers perfume. She discovers fashion.
And she discovers her hidden vice, romance novels.
Tales of chivalry. In the 1500s, these were the absolute equivalent of trashy supermarket paperbacks or, binge watching a soap opera.
She was hooked.
She was obsessed. She said she couldn't be happy unless she had a new book in her hands.
This paints a picture of someone who is just very concerned with the external world. She wanted to be liked.
Incredibly charismatic.
Yeah.
Everyone loved her. She was witty, she was beautiful, and she knew how to work a room. She was vain. She worried about her hands. Her hair, a total social butterfly.
So she eventually enters the convent. But this isn't some road to Damascus moment where she suddenly becomes holy. She enters the monastery of the Incarnation, but she kind of brings the world with her.
This is the period of the double life. And I think this is where a lot of modern listeners will really see themselves. The convent she joined, it wasn't exactly a prison.
No.
It was more like a boarding house for noble ladies. They had comfortable suites, they wore jewelry, and the parlor, the guest room, was the social hub of Avila.
So she's a nun, but she's essentially hosting parties.
Constantly. She spent hours every day in the parlor chatting with visitors, flirting a little, gossiping, and then she would go to the chapel and try to pray.
Okay, I want to push back on this a bit because from a modern secular perspective, this sounds fine. She's sociable, she's nice, she's not murdering anyone, she's not stealing. Why is chatting considered such a spiritual failure for her?
That is the crucial question. Because to the average person, she was a good nun. But Teresa was starting to perceive a different metric. She realized that by giving 50% of her attention to God and 50% to the world, she was actually fracturing her own soul.
It's about fragmentation.
Yes. She writes about the torture of this state. She says, I wished to live, but I saw clearly that I was not living, but rather wrestling with the shadow of death.
Wow.
She felt that every time she engaged in that superficial, ego-driven socializing, she was leaking energy. She was diluting the self that was meant for the absolute.
So for a mystic, wickedness isn't necessarily breaking a moral law.
Yeah.
It's mediocrity.
Precisely. It's the refusal to be fully awake.
Yeah.
She felt she was sleepwalking through her social life, and the double life was tearing her apart because she knew deep down that the God she was praying to demanded a monopoly. You can't negotiate a timeshare with the infinite.
And then the universe forces her hand. She gets sick.
Violently sick. We still debate what it was, malaria, catalepsy, maybe an autoimmune disorder. But she collapses. She is paralyzed. She is bedridden for 3 years.
And there's that story they actually thought she was dead.
They dug her grave. She was in a coma for 4 days. They dripped hot wax on her eyelids to see if she would flinch, and she didn't. Her father was the only reason she wasn't buried alive. He refused to let the body go.
When she wakes up, she's an invalid. She has to crawl on her hands and knees.
And this is the catalyst. Suffering stripped everything away. She couldn't go to the parlor. She couldn't look pretty. She couldn't charm the Duke. When you are paralyzed and in pain, the distractions of the world just evaporate.
You're left alone with yourself.
It's the removal of the noise. And in that silence, she finally started to pray. Not just saying words, but actually entering the interior.
This brings us to the core of her teaching. She doesn't just say, pray harder. She gives us a map, a geography of prayer. She calls it the 4 waters.
This is her masterpiece. She uses this extended metaphor. She says, imagine your soul is a garden. The soil is weedy and barren. That's our natural state.
Sure.
We want to grow flowers, virtues for the emperor, who is God. But flowers need water. The defining difference between the stages of prayer is simply, where does the water come from and how much work do you have to do to get it?
It's an efficiency scale.
Exactly. It's a sliding scale of human effort versus divine grace.
Let's walk through these because I think they describe psychological states that even a non-believer might recognize. The first water, drawing from the well.
This is the beginner stage. And it is brutal. Imagine a well. You have a bucket on a rope. You have to lower the bucket, pull it up hand over hand, and carry it to the flowers.
Yeah.
It is manual labor. It is exhausting.
What is this actually describing in terms of mental practice?
This is discursive meditation. This is using your intellect to work. You sit down and you force your brain to focus. You read a passage, you think about it, you try to visualize Christ. You analyze your own behavior.
And she says this is where most people quit.
Because it's so hard. She talks about the buzzing flies of thought. You sit down to think about the nature of truth, and your brain goes, did I lock the door? I'm hungry. That guy at the market was rude to me.
The monkey mind.
Yes. And Teresa is so validating here. She admits that for years, she hated this. She would shake the hourglass to make the time go faster. But she says you have to do it. You have to drop the bucket and pull. You have to build the discipline of attention.
So if you stick with the manual labor, eventually you get an upgrade. The second water, the windlass and bucket.
Now we have a machine, a crank. You're still doing the work, you're turning the handle, but you get way more water for less sweat. This is what she calls the prayer of quiet.
The psychology of this stage is fascinating. She describes a split in consciousness.
This is a crucial distinction. In this stage, the will becomes captivated by God. The will is quiet, it's in love, it's centered. But the intellect and the imagination are still running wild.
She calls the intellect a restless butterfly or a dove looking for a place to sit.
And her advice here is so counterintuitive. Usually when we meditate, if our mind wanders, we get angry. We try to wrestle the mind back into place.
Right.
Teresa says, ignore the butterfly.
Just let it buzz.
Yes. She says, your will is connected to the signal. Your mind is just noise. Don't let the noise disturb the deep quiet of the will. It's a very sophisticated understanding of the mind, that you could be deeply focused and superficially distracted at the same time. She basically says, don't fight your own brain, just bypass it.
Then we get to the third water, the stream or river.
Now the gardener barely works. A river flows into the garden. The ground is soaked. This is the sleep of the faculties.
Sleep of the faculties. That sounds like a trance.
It's getting close. In this state, the understanding and the memory, they stop buzzing. They go to sleep. They are fully absorbed in the experience of God. The butterfly has landed.
She uses the Martha and Mary analogy here, right?
She does. She says in this state, the soul is so saturated that it can actually perform acts of charity. You can walk around and do things, but your deep center is completely locked onto God.
A functioning body, but your consciousness is elsewhere.
Exactly.
And finally, the fourth water, the rain.
This is the end of the line for human effort. Rain comes from the sky. The gardener does nothing. You can't make it rain. You can only receive it.
This is union.
Complete union. And this is where the text gets very physical. She says the senses are suspended. You can't see. You can't hear. The body might become cold or rigid. You couldn't move your arm if you wanted to.
Okay, we have to pause here because this is where the materialist says seizure, catatonia, hysteria.
Absolutely. And Teresa brings that up herself. She was terrified it was the devil or madness. But here is that God versus atheism pivot. A materialist says this state is a malfunction of the brain. Teresa says, no, this is the brain being hijacked by a superior intelligence.
How does she know the difference? If you're frozen and you can't move, how do you know you aren't just having a breakdown?
The output, the data of the aftermath. She says that madness leaves the soul tired, confused, and broken. But after this union, she wakes up energized. She wakes up wiser. She wakes up with the courage to fight the entire Spanish religious hierarchy to reform her order.
So her argument is kind of, if I'm crazy, how am I so effective?
Exactly. Madness doesn't produce executive function. This experience constructs a stronger, more rational person. She says the self, the little ego that worries about reputation disappears and God takes over the mechanism.
Let's go deeper into the phenomena, because once she hits these higher waters, the special effects start. She starts hearing voices.
Locution.
Now, hearing voices is generally a one-way ticket to a psychiatric ward. How does she distinguish divine locutions from, I'm just talking to myself?
She gives us a test, a very clear one. She distinguishes between self-talk and divine speech.
What's the difference?
First, self-talk is muffled. It's like listening to a bad recording. You have to strain to hear it. And crucially, you construct the sentence. It takes time. You can choose to stop listening.
And the divine voice.
It captures your attention instantly. You cannot ignore it. It is clearer than physical sound, even though you hear it with the ears of the soul. But the ultimate test, and I love this, is that divine words are actions.
Words are deeds.
Right. Think about it. If you are having a panic attack and you tell yourself, be calm, does it work?
Rarely. If ever.
Right. But she says if God says be calm, the calm happens simultaneously with the word. The word creates the reality it describes. She says, I was in darkness, and it said, let there be light, and I was instantly illuminated. She argues that the human imagination cannot forge that kind of efficacy. You can't hallucinate a change in your fundamental state of being that quickly.
She also sees things, visions, but again, not what I expected. She talks about intellectual visions, which sounds like a total oxymoron. How can you have a vision without an image?
This is so hard for us to grasp because we were so visual. But imagine you are in a pitch black room. You can't see anything, but you know with 100% certainty that your best friend is standing right next to you. You feel their presence.
Okay, I can imagine that.
That is an intellectual vision. She says she felt Jesus walking at her right side. She couldn't see him with her eyes, but she knew he was there more clearly than if she had seen him. It's perception without sensation.
But she did have some visual experiences, and the one I want to unpack is the diamond. Because this feels like the moment where her cosmology completely separates from the standard view.
The diamond vision. This is absolutely pivotal.
Describe it.
She sees God, but not as an old man on a cloud. She sees a diamond, a clear, limpid, infinitely large diamond. And the shock is, the diamond contains everything. The whole universe is inside the diamond.
That flips the geometry. Usually we think God is up there or out there.
And she says no. God is the context. We are in him.
And then the horror sets in.
Yes, because she sees her own sins. And she sees them as these foul, ugly, dark things. But the horror isn't just that they're ugly, it's where they are. Yeah. She realizes that when she sins, she is excreting this filth inside the purity of the diamond.
That reframes the concept of sin entirely. It's not, I broke a rule and the judge is mad.
No, it's, I am polluting the medium of existence. It's an ontological violation. She says, it was a piteous thing to see such foul things present in the pure brilliancy of that light.
It's like throwing trash in a pristine museum gallery, but you're locked in the gallery.
Worse. You're throwing trash inside the consciousness that sustains you. This vision ties back to the atheism debate perfectly. For Teresa, there is no outside. You can't step outside of God to critique him, because you are made of him. He is the container.
So we have voices that act as commands and diamonds that contain the cosmos. But we have to talk about the physical stuff, the stuff that made the other nuns nervous. The rapture.
The ecstasies, this is where it gets violent.
She distinguishes between union, which was the rain, and rapture.
Yes, union is smooth, gentle. Rapture is an ambush. She says it's like a giant eagle swooping down and snatching you up by your hair. You cannot resist it.
She actually tried to resist it.
She did. She would be in the choir, praying with the other nuns, and she'd feel the eagle coming. She would grab the bars of the grill. She would hold onto the furniture. She was terrified of making a scene.
And she talks about levitation. Do we take this literally?
She writes about it literally. She says the body loses its weight. She mentions asking the other nuns to sit on her to keep her from floating up.
That is such a vivid, almost comical image. A pile of nuns sitting on a saint to keep her on the ground.
But it underscores the physical force of it. And then there is the pain, the transverberation.
The angel with the spear.
This is the most famous moment in her life, immortalized by Bernini's statue. She sees a small angel holding a long golden spear with a tip of fire, and he plunges it into her heart repeatedly.
She describes the pain as excruciating. She says it made her moan aloud.
But, and here is the paradox that just breaks the materialist brain. She says the sweetness was so excessive that she didn't want it to stop. She calls it a delicious wound.
How do we even parse that pain that is pleasure?
It suggests that at a certain level of intensity, the binary of pain and pleasure just collapses. It's just signal. It's contact. It's the sensation of the finite container, the body, being stretched by the infinite. It wasn't sadism. It was an expansion of the heart's capacity, done with surgical violence.
So that's the height. Now we have to go to the depth. Because she didn't just go up, she went down. She went to hell.
Chapter 32, one of the most harrowing things I've ever read.
And again, it's not cartoons. It's not devils poking you with pitchforks. It's much more psychological.
She says she was transported bodily, she thinks, to the place the devils had prepared for me.
What does she see?
She sees a hole in the wall, a tunnel. It looks like a cupboard. She describes mud, reptiles, a terrible stench. But the defining characteristic of hell for Teresa is compression.
Claustrophobia.
A radical claustrophobia.
Yeah.
She says she felt like she was being pressed between two walls. It's the loss of space. And metaphysically, it's the loss of the diamond. If heaven is the infinite space of God, hell is being jammed into a tiny hole with your own ego.
She talks about the fire in the soul.
She says, I felt a fire in my soul. I cannot describe it. It wasn't just external burning. It was an internal tearing. She calls it oppression, suffocation, and affliction.
And the despair.
That was the worst part. The knowledge that it would never end. She says the psychological horror of knowing there was no hope was worse than the physical pain.
And what was the result of this vision? Did she just hide under the covers?
No. And this is the pattern with her. The vision terrified her into action. She realized, I have to stop playing around. This vision is actually what drove her to reform the Carmelite order. She wanted to save souls from that experience. It wasn't abstract theology to her. She had been there, she had smelled the mud, and she didn't want anyone else to go.
We've talked about the mechanics of prayer, the visions, the hell, but I want to land on her theology of God himself. Because after all this, she comes to a realization about the nature of reality.
The intellectual vision of the Trinity.
She sees the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, not as a math puzzle, but as a society. Three persons, distinct, yet one.
And she realizes that God is truth itself.
What does that mean?
He is truth. It means he isn't just a being who tells the truth. He is the standard by which reality is measured. And this leads to her most radical philosophical stance, which flips the modern script entirely.
The idea that the world is the lie.
Exactly. We sit here and think, this microphone is real, my car is real, my bank account is real. God is a hypothesis. Teresa says, no, God is the diamond. God is the solid, unchangeable truth. This life, this is the shadow, this is the dream.
She calls life a night.
She says, I see that we are asleep. For her, the mystical experience is actually the waking up experience. When she comes out of a rapture, she looks at the world, her reputation, money, comfort, and she laughs. She calls them dirt because she has seen the real and now she has to deal with the shadow.
That sounds incredibly isolating, to walk around feeling like everyone else is playing a game that doesn't matter.
It is profound solitude, but And this is why Teresa is a saint and not just a crazy person living in a cave. She doesn't stay in that solitude. She turns back to the world.
This is segment 6, the practical lessons. The active mystic, because she became a CEO, essentially.
She was a powerhouse. She founded convents all over Spain. She was buying real estate, managing disputes, hiring contractors, dealing with lawsuits.
How do you reconcile the world is dirt with, I need to buy this house and I need a good interest rate?
That's the genius of her Martha and Mary teaching. In the Bible, Mary sits at Jesus' feet, which is contemplation, and Martha runs around cooking, which is action. Usually people say Mary is better.
Right.
Teresa says, you need both. She says God walks among the pots and pans.
Meaning you can find the diamond while you're doing the dishes.
Meaning that if your mysticism doesn't work in the kitchen, it's not real mysticism. If you can only find God when you're in a silent trance, you haven't really found God. You've just found a quiet mental state. True union means you can carry that intellectual vision of the Trinity into a contract negotiation. You can see the diamond while you were dealing with the plumber.
She has a definition of humility that I think is perfect here, because she's always calling herself wicked, which can get a little annoying. But then she defines humility simply.
Humility is walking in truth.
That's it.
That's it. It's not slumping your shoulders and saying, I'm trash. It's seeing things exactly as they are. If you were good at painting, humility is knowing you were good at painting, but knowing that the talent comes from God. If you're a sinner, humility is admitting it. It's radical realism. She says, God is the supreme truth, and to be humble is to walk with him in the truth.
I also love her stance on obedience. Because she was a visionary, but she submitted to her confessors, even the dumb ones.
And she had some very dumb ones, unlearned men who told her she was possessed. But she had a rule. If a vision told her to do X and her boss, the confessor, told her to do Y, she would do Y.
And the vision was okay with that.
The vision praised her for it. She says the Lord told her that obedience is the highest virtue. Why? Because visions can be tricked. The devil can fake a vision. Your own ego can fake a vision, but the devil cannot fake the humility of submission. By obeying a human authority, she was grounding herself in reality and defeating the ego. It was her safety net against madness.
So we've tracked this massive arc, from the teenage girl reading romance novels and worrying about her hair, to the paralyzed Avilid finding God in the silence, to the mystic levitating in the choir, to the founder managing an empire of convents.
It is the arc of a human soul stretching to its absolute limit.
If we have to distill this deep dive into a single takeaway for the listener, someone who isn't a nun, who maybe isn't even religious, what is it?
I think the takeaway is that the spiritual life is not a wellness routine. It's not about feeling good or finding balance. It is a rigorous, often painful process of expanding your capacity to hold reality. Teresa teaches us that the material world is not a closed loop. There is a more. And accessing that more costs you everything, but it gives you back a self that is actually real.
It's about dropping the bucket, ignoring the butterfly, and letting the rain fall.
Exactly.
Here's the final thought I want to leave you with. Teresa suggests that God is the only real thing, and that our physical life, your job, your stress, the traffic, the news, is the night. She thinks we are sleepwalking through a shadow world. If she is right, even a little bit right, and our waking life is actually the dream, what does that mean for the things you were worrying about today? Are you stressing over shadows?
That is the question.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.